So it's that time of year again when snakes are hibernating, and I get tons of messages from people that ask me, why do snakes hibernate? Does my snake need to hibernate? I'm going to try to cover all these topics in this week's Snake Bite Show. So let's start by talking about hibernation. When it comes to snakes, it's really even called overwintering, dormancy, or even brumation. But snakes are not like bears. They don't just climb into a den and stay there for 3 or 4 months. Because they're ectothermic, meaning that they can't regulate their body temperatures, when the temperature cools down, they go into the dormant period. Now, even in the middle of winter, if the temperatures go up to 70 or 80 degrees and sunny, snakes will come out of their dens and actually warm themselves up. But I want to talk about, does your snake need to hibernate? Or why do snakes need to hibernate at all in this week's show? So there's really 2 reasons why we hibernate snakes here at our facility anyways. One is a simple one. It's about economics and time management. If we can put our snakes down in hibernation for 3 months, that means that we don't have to really expend a lot of energy into them for those 3 months. It's actually good for the snakes to go dormant, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but also it gets them out of our hair, so to speak. Hey, we love our animals, but when we get them out of our hair, number one, we save money feeding them, but also we have more time at doing other things, so we can allocate our time to the other projects. In this case, breeding pythons this time of year. So while we have a ton of time and energy during the summer months breeding, feeding, cleaning colubrids and other snakes that hibernate, during the winter we can spend that time on breeding our pythons, which is great. But number 2 is really the aid of breeding. Now there are some people that breed colubrid snakes like this rhino rat snake or this Mexican black king snake, and they don't hibernate them at all, and they breed them completely successfully. But the truth is, most people would agree that a dormancy period actually helps in 2 ways. It kind of triggers follicular growth in females. It tells females that, okay, we've been through the winter. Oh, that guy bit me, look at that. This guy's still a cheeky monkey and still wants to eat, obviously. But the second thing that happens is in males, they have what they call spermatogenesis. Now, a lot of people believe that a cooling period actually fires the spermatogenesis. These snakes actually will breed in the spring months. So a hibernation is actually good just for them in the sense of increasing your potential success when it comes to breeding. And for now, I need to figure out a way to get this guy off my finger. Now, if you have a pet snake like a hognose snake or a corn snake or whatever snake you might have, a lot of people ask me, do I need to hibernate my snake? And the truth is, you don't need to hibernate your snake. You know, it helps when you're breeding or you're on a commercial level like we are to hibernate because it does increase your chances of successful breeding. But that doesn't mean you need to hibernate your snake. So if you have a pet and it continues to feed throughout the winter, just continue to feed it. You don't have to cool it whatsoever. Now, with that said, there are some even pet snakes that will typically, once they hit 2 or 3 or 4 years old and they're sexually mature, will actually go off of food during the winter. So say come October, November, when the temperatures start to drop, they'll go off of food. So at that point, you could do one of 2 things. You could just maintain and try to offer them food, and maybe they'll go back on over the winter, or you can find a cool spot, say in your closet, or if you have a basement or somewhere where you can actually cool them off for say a month or 2, and then once you bring them back up and warm them up, then they'll start eating. As a matter of fact, there's sometimes a way to trick them, believe it or not. You can find a cool spot, say about 60 degrees in your house somewhere that's nice and dark. You can put them in there for say 2 or 3 weeks, then warm them up. In that short period of time, in their head, they're thinking, all right, I hibernated over the winter, now it's time for spring. And even though it's maybe the end of December or January, they're thinking, hey, let's start eating again. We've even done that with breeding cycles where we've altered their breeding cycle a little bit by cooling them off for a very short period of time. And I'll give you an example. If we have baby snakes that are, say, 1.5 years old and we want them to breed, but they're not quite big enough to hibernate along with the rest of the adult group, we'll continue to feed them for an additional month or month and a half, and then we'll only hibernate them for 2 or 3 weeks as opposed to 3 months, and we still have the same success. All right, so let's get on to what snakes and what lizards actually hibernate and at what temperatures they do. When it comes to corn snakes, king snakes, rat snakes, milk snakes, even hognose snakes. So the majority of colubrids, but not all of them, we're going to cover a couple colubrids that don't hibernate at this temperature. They'll actually cool down to about 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit for, again, 3 months. So we bring them all the way down to that temperature, and then we cool them off for 3 months. We keep them dark and we keep them cold, and all we do is check on them and give them fresh water once a week, and they're completely fine at that level. But again, that's only those handful of animals that get down to that temperature. Let's move on to a couple colubrids that actually don't get that cold. So I have to be careful when I say that colubrids hibernate, because not all colubrids hibernate, or at least not hibernate to those temperatures. Take, for instance, house snakes, which are really from South Africa and up into Namibia and a few other areas in that region of the continent of Africa. They don't get very cold. They do cool down a little bit, but they don't get cold. If we put these guys down at 50 degrees, they'll actually probably perish. So what we do is we cool these down to about 65 to 70 degrees, along with our Creebows. The Creebows are actually an unusual one because, again, they're a Central American animal that really doesn't get that cool whatsoever, and they're such an incredible snake. Big, fat, thick-bodied animals, extremely strong. But these guys only cool down to about 70 degrees, and unlike the house snake that typically cools down and then breeds in the spring, these guys will actually breed during the cool down period. So we usually start cooling them down around December, and by the middle of January, we're already starting to put them together when they're cooled down, and we'll continue to breed them as they warm up. So basically, the females will start to produce follicles during the cool down period. Okay, let's jump to lizards really quick, in particular blue-tongued skinks. Now, there's different localities and species or subspecies of blue-tongued skink, and they all act a little bit differently. This happens to be a centralian or a multifasciata. These guys come from the red center of Australia, and you gotta remember, like any desert, it gets really hot and really cold, right? The last time I was in Alice Springs, where these guys are from, it was actually 30 degrees in the morning every time we woke up, but then it would warm up into the mid-70s during the day. So the centralians actually can cool off pretty cold. They can literally get down to about 50 degrees. Now again, remember, if it's 30 degrees outside, that doesn't mean where they're at is 30 degrees, because they're burrowing into the rocks where that they've got some shelter. So they're probably staying about 50 degrees. Although I wouldn't be surprised that there are times these guys can get down into the 40s and maybe even the upper 30s. But they hibernate pretty cool and, again, come out to sun during the day typically. Although the entire time we were there hunting, we never came across any of them whatsoever because it was really still too cold. Now, when you get into, say, the easterns and the northerns, they cool off typically. We bring them down to about 70 degrees. The easterns can definitely get cooler than that, but we choose not to cool them down too much. So we'll give them about a 2-month dormant period, where we, again, just like the snakes, we don't feed them, we don't do anything to them, we just give them water, and we keep them for about 2 months that way at about 65 to 70 degrees. And then when you warm these guys up, they'll go through a shed cycle relatively quick, and that's when they're gonna breed. I'm going to make some generalizations now, but remember, you have to kind of do your own homework when it comes to each individual species, because not everything is in a bubble, right? So most pythons and boas will cool down during the winter, but will not really brumate, right? So what we do, say, with a ball python is we take them from 83 or 84 degrees during the day, which is typically what they're going to be, and we cool them down to about 76 to 78 degrees at night. But we typically keep the hot spot relatively constant. We may cool just a slight amount on the hot spot during the breeding season, just to ensure that we don't burn any of the sperm off that the male may be producing through spermatogenesis. Now, these guys will breed during the cool down, and we go anywhere from 3 to 4 months during that cool down, and then we warm them up. And typically when you warm them up, the females will start to grow follicles, and that's when they'll actually ovulate, and then a couple months, 2.5 months later, actually lay eggs. Now, that goes with a lot of pythons. Not all pythons will do that. There's some pythons that cool very much a lot more, and even boa constrictors. They're a little bit different. We have the exact same cool down, but what happens is you usually want to cool them down a little bit sooner, like, say, October as opposed to November, December, that you would do with the ball python area. And then, you know, again, that's a generalization, but most boas will cool and breed during that cool down. So again, boas typically will breed in October, whereas ball pythons are more like November, December area. Again, generalization, do your research on your own species. The one boa that is different would happen to be the Brazilian rainbows, or really all the rainbow boas. They'll still cool down the same months as, say, the pythons and the other boas, but they don't breed until the spring. So we'll give them a 2 to 3 month period where we're cooling them off at night, bringing them back up to temperatures. During that period of time, we feed the females really heavily, and then as soon as we have that warm up, say the end of February, March, or even April, then we start putting males and females together. So as you can see, it's not a general rule where all boas and pythons breed the exact same way. When it comes to rainbow boas and even tree boas, they're typically spring breeders after the cool down. Let's talk about another lizard, and that would be the leopard gecko. Now let me start by saying, if you have a pet leopard gecko, you don't need to hibernate it. You can keep it up as long as it's eating year round. That's fine, but don't be surprised if it does slow down its food during the winter months. But if it eats a little bit, just keep it up and be normal. But we do hibernate leopard geckos. What we do is we cool them down for about 2 months down to 60 to 65 degrees. Now what's interesting about leopard geckos, and to some extent snakes too, is you can manipulate the time of year. So the normal time would be to cool them down in December and January, bring them up in February or in that range and start breeding them. But if you hibernate for the first time, so when they're only a year old, you can actually manipulate the time that you breed them by the time that you hibernate them. Now once they've been hibernated, say in December and January, you can only manipulate maybe a couple weeks each way, or you start to have infertility problems. But if it's a first-year animal, you could hibernate it in September, or you could hibernate it in June, and you can have a 2-month hibernation where you actually have to cool them down into some sort of a refrigeration type system, and you can actually breed. So some of the big leopard geckos breeders, believe it or not, will have 4 or 5 different cycles of different animals. That way they are hatching 365 days a year, and unlike us, they don't have a glut of animals all at once. They hatch them throughout the entire year. So that's pretty cool. And again, it does work to some extent with snakes, although you do see a drop in fertility when you start manipulating the snakes. Again, going back to what I said earlier, you can't do it once you've established the hibernation time. You can't manipulate that much. It has to be the first time, and then you have to keep it that way for the rest of its life. So anyways, guys, I hope that you guys have learned a little bit about hibernation, the do's, the don'ts, the whys, and all the other things. As always, guys, I'm vlogging my way through life. I'm doing the daily vlog, so make sure to check it out down in the description, and subscribe to that channel as well if you want to see what it's like to be a reptile breeder. And I'm also Facebook and tweeting, Instagram and Snapchat my way through things. So make sure to follow me over at SnakeBytesTV. Until next week, you've been watching Snake Bites.